Welcome to the Daniel deep dive on Antiochus Epiphanes. You may have never heard of him before, or maybe the fact that you clicked on this video means you have and you're interested. So some background, this is essentially us using the 70th 7 math and starting to use the 70th 7 key to unlock other parts of Daniel. How is it able to do that? That's what we'll dive into today and use it very specifically in Daniel chapter 8, Daniel chapter 11, to talk about a guy who's not referenced there, but who is very much present there and who gets a lot of attention. And I hope that by the end of this video, whether you have heard of him or not have not heard of him, that you will agree with me that he needs less attention, or he at least needs less credit for his role in Daniel chapter 11. So let's dive in. Again, I mentioned chapter 11 talks about this guy. But first, I want to mention one thing that is covered a little more in depth in a different video where we cover the rest of Daniel. The other visions, we've covered the 70th 7 in depth, but there's really 5 visions that have to do with the same thing. There's some other visions and dreams that are sort of historical about Nebuchadnezzar, and so not including that. So when I say 5, it's that there are 5 that follow the same pattern. In that video, we unpack that pattern. Not going to unpack the full thing here, but just to introduce the concept, because it will come up here. Essentially, those visions, the pattern they follow is there's 3 main pieces. The first part is there's a roadmap that leads up to a pivot, and then after that pivot, what's under discussion is the 70th 7. Okay, so those are the 3 parts. There's a roadmap that usually involves kingdoms, and it's a kind of an earthly view. It's historical. It lines up very well with the history books, which we'll talk about a little bit today in this video. So it shows the progression of kingdoms, earthly kingdoms, nations, if you will, empires, and in some cases is very generic. But in other cases, in this case of chapter 11 of Daniel, very specific. There's a ton of detail. It's very lengthy and it's very detailed, and it lines up very well with those historical empires and what they did and some of their leaders, emperors or kings or what have you. And so, but then you reach a pivot, and what we'll talk about is where that pivot happens here in chapter 11. We cover it in the other video. For each of the visions where the pivot happens, and we identify that very explicitly, so it's hopefully a helpful aid as you're reading Daniel. You can have that as a handy guide and know when have I reached that transition point and when am I after that. When you're after the transition point, things are different, and there's not always a direct link between the last thing on the roadmap and the 70th 7 being talked about in that particular vision. They're talked about from different angles, different perspectives. Some are more about war. That's what this one is. Some are more about judgment. All of these things are encapsulated in the crucifixion. So again, now that we know the 70th 7 is centered on the crucifixion, it's about the crucifixion. We see that all of these visions are different angles on that one glorious and terrible event. And so that helps with aiding understanding and the interpretation of those passages, because now verses that were potentially confusing, like, are we still talking about Antiochus or have we moved on? And all of the scholars agree that there's some transition point. There's a lot of debate about where the transition point is. We're going to make our claim very explicitly that we can see where it is because of the language and the 70th 7 and the fact that we know what the abomination that causes desolation is. So some of these things become extremely helpful keys, interpretive keys in other passages in Daniel to identify where we are in the story. Are we in that lead-up period, the roadmap, or are we at the transition verses, or are we past the transition verses where now we're talking about the cosmic significance of the 70th 7? So that's the pattern, and you see it in all 5 visions, and you definitely also see it here. This is one of the 5 in chapter 11. So a little background first. Who is Antiochus Epiphanes? He was a Seleucid king who was in power from about 175 to 164 BC. He desecrates the temple, the Jerusalem temple, in 167 BC. That's one of his big claims to fame and why you're hearing about him right now, and why there's a lot of confusion, because he did actually do some bad stuff. He did stop sacrifices. He kind of ended the temple practices and operation of the temple in Jerusalem. He erected a Zeus altar, and he did the famous deed of offering a pig on the altar to try to desecrate it and ruin it and, offend the people. And he was a bad dude, right? So clearly not a good guy. So he did all those things. Those things triggered the Maccabean revolt. So if you've heard of the Maccabees, this would be their time period. There are two books for the, I guess it's called First Maccabees, Second Maccabees, in the Apocrypha. So it's not in some Bibles, but it's in the group of books that are in what's called the Apocrypha that are in some Bibles. So different Christian traditions. Some would treat that as those books as inspired scripture, and some would not. And so we'll talk about that a little bit, because I have nothing against the Maccabees. I think they were zealous and good and all that, but I think I would agree that their book is not inspired scripture because of what I'll get to later that has to do with what we're talking about today. So more on that. Everyone agrees that it's in Daniel 11, 21 through 30 that we're talking about Antiochus. Okay, I say everyone. That really is pretty much everyone. I don't know of any camp that doesn't think that. So the history, the historical details provided in the chapter here are so well aligned with the actual historical record that it's quite clear. Okay, so nothing big there. The question becomes: is he also in verse 31? And related, is he chapter 9, verse 27? Is he in chapter 12, verse 11? Some of these other places where we see similar language. Okay, from chapter 9, we know we're talking about the abomination that causes desolation. It's also in chapter 12. It's referenced differently, but similar language, but not precisely the same language in chapter 8. So we have videos on those as well. So we've covered that in the 2300 number that's in chapter 8. So the question is, here in chapter 11, has the text moved on at verse 31, or are we still talking about Antiochus? Okay. So structure of Daniel 11, as I mentioned, is a historical roadmap. I'm just going to put all these here at once for you. So verses 2 through 4, Persia, Alexander the Great, kingdoms are being divided and split up. Then the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, again, very detailed, very datable. For those 15 verses, 5 through 20. And then 21 through 30 is Antiochus. And he is what I'm going to say is the last in the line of this roadmap. And that's where the confusion comes in, which we're going to be unpacking. But he's the last one in this roadmap. Why? Not because of any particular deed that he did. That's where the confusion comes in. It's that he's the last one before the main act begins. Okay, and we'll talk about that from an empire perspective. In verse 30, he is humiliated by Rome. We'll read the verse on the next slide. And he rages on the way home. And specifically, what that means is he went into Israel and he desecrated Jerusalem, did the temple stuff that he did kind of on his way back. It's not exactly on the way, so I don't know how that happened. So I don't think that's on your way back, because I think he was going from Egypt back to Rome. But in any case, again, well established historically, he did all of those things. And that verse 30 describes that he had a humiliation. He says he will lose heart, and but then he'll rage against the people of the covenant, something to that effect, and then he's done. So verse 31 starts to say, forces from him will arise. We're going to unpack that in a minute. Suffice it to say, verses 32 through 35, there's a significant register shift, meaning the language is very different than what we've had for several dozen verses before, right? And so that's a significant textual clue that maybe we're now talking about something new. Remember, there's no chapters and verses or section headers in the original writings. And so if there's a shift, we have to pick it up from clues in the words and the verbiage. And so again, knowing this pattern is helpful that we find in Daniel. Maybe can't tell exactly the first time, but once we've read all of them, we get a little bit of help from Revelation as well. But we once we know that pattern, we can say, oh, okay, now let's read it again. Oh, okay, now that shift point, that pivot becomes very clear, and we can actually tell where it happens. In those verses, we're going to hear about suffering, not warfare. We've been hearing about warfare the whole time, all these different wars and battles and, kings toppling kings and so forth. we're going to hear words about refinement and kind of good things as opposed to revolt. Well, not that revolt is bad, but again, it's a register shift. It's a totally different flavor of languages. We're also going to see some things like until the time of the end, which should be a clue. Again, we let Scripture interpret Scripture. Sometimes the first read of the passage may not be clear, and but when we read lots of other passages, they offer additional insights that we can then bring back to that passage, read it again, and have more understanding than we had the first time. And so we read until the time of the end. Well, that should ring a bell now that you know the 70 to 7 and you know how that works. And you know the terminology from chapter 9 and chapter 12, this until the time of the end. Anytime you see that kind of verbiage in Daniel, that is a clue that you are post-pivot in the vision, and you are talking about the 70 to 7, from which, again, refresher, goes from the incarnation. Crucifixion is the start point. The crucifixion is the middle, and the end is judgment and the desolation of the Old Covenant Israel and Jerusalem and the temple. So that is the period that is of primary importance. Really, I will say this, that is the purpose of these visions. The visions are talking about that. That is the main point. Everything else is preamble. All of the stuff with the prior to the pivot in the visions is just preamble to give you temporal markers so you know where you are in history and when the main act is beginning. Okay, verse 30, ships of Kittim will come against him, and he will lose heart. Then he will turn back and vent his fury against the Holy Covenant. Okay, so 168 BC, he gets confronted in Egypt, and he withdraws permanently. So he's kind of done. He packs up his army and goes home. But on the way home, he rages against Jerusalem and wreaks havoc in the Holy Land and in Jerusalem itself and in the temple itself, very specifically. But what we're going to show here is that verse 30 is his exit from the scriptures. He dies in Persia in 164 BC. Okay, at this point, he will lose heart. He'll turn back. On the way back, he'll vent his fury against the Holy Covenant. That's not the beginning of a new passage where he's the main character. This is the end of the passage about him, and it's almost a footnote. I don't mean any disrespect, but it's almost a footnote that he vented his fury against the Holy Covenant on the way back. So, again, how do we know that? I'm going to show in the text why we say that. And again, you can see already a little bit of the source of confusion, so it's kind of fair that, it's almost, you can read it as this is a prelude or a foreshadowing or whatever. It's a statement that's serving up the next thing that I'm going to talk about as an author, right? If this was the author writing this, Daniel. But we're going to show that the language prevents you from thinking that. But it's fair at the end of that sentence to think, oh, okay, maybe the next part is going to be about him coming against the Holy Covenant. But we read in verse 31, forces from him will arise. They will desecrate the sanctuary fortress and abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. So now we're seeing, again, other familiar words that are our cue to, have light bulbs going off in our minds that this is familiar territory. We know what some of this stuff is. And we know that those things are not associated with Antiochus because he was in 164 BC time frame. And so, 200 years before some of these things are happening, or at least, 160 from the birth of Christ ballpark. So he's not associated with some of these words. So let's unpack some of them in detail, though, because one of the initial tripping points is this forces from him will arise, not his forces. I think some English translations will say his forces, but it's not his forces. That's a different word. There's no possessive pronoun here that says his. It's not forces that belong to whoever the his is. His forces. It says forces from him, and that word from implies a source. That means he's the source of those things. Not that it's his army. Okay, it's very different. We read it as his armies. We're going to be very confused, and that's some of the confusion. From indicates origin. It is something new arising out of what came before. Okay, so Rome absorbed the Seleucid territories and is the imperial successor to Antiochus and his political structure. So why does that matter? Because, again, the point of the roadmaps is to let you know They are time markers to let you know when the big act has arrived. That is the big, and all the players are on scene for the main act, and that it's beginning. And that's the main point of what God is trying to communicate. And what he really wants to talk about is what's going to happen during that time period, right? Because again, that is the 70th seven. It is centered on the crucifixion. The cross is the point of the whole thing. These visions are about Christ crucified. So the other is just pointers. It's just a roadmap, right? It's just the red carpet being rolled out so that we know where we are in time and we can expect him. So that God wanted them to know. It was not supposed to be a surprise that Jesus came on scene. There were a lot of prophetic markers to make it clear. And this is one of them. So this is a roadmap. Think of it as mile markers, okay? Like green signs. I'm an American here. We have green mile markers, mile 3, mile 37, mile 38. And you kind of know where you are as you go along this road. And that's very much what all of these roadmap passages are. The pre-pivot is just to let you know where you are. And it gives it several different times in several different visions. And they all line up. It's the same thing. All right, so Rome is... So forces from him will arise fits Rome. They came, as a political entity, came from Antiochus's political entity. Okay, so of him or from him comes this. Now, why is that important? Because Rome is the main actor politically during the main act, right? So it's the political actor on stage during the main act, where the crucifixion is going to happen, where Jesus arrives. So that's why it's just a roadmap to get you to them, and then boom, now we're in the new stuff. And guess who's gone? Antiochus is gone. He's left the building. Now we're talking about the next generation, because the very next generation of geopolitical reality is when the big stuff is going to take place. And so all we did was get us a roadmap to know, oh, okay, it's this one. It's the one that comes after Antiochus. It's the one the political entity that arises from him. Okay, same two markers as chapter 9 and chapter 12. So abolish the daily sacrifice, the abomination that causes desolation. We now know about what those things are. So rather than, the misreading is to take Antiochus forward past verse 30 into verse 31 and say, oh, it's his armies. They're going to desecrate the sanctuary. They're going to abolish the daily sacrifice. They're going to set up the abomination that causes desolation. Again, the first two sentences there, it would be fair to say, okay, forces from him will arise. Again, the words imply something other than him. It's not his forces. It's something else. They will desecrate the sanctuary fortress. Okay, maybe that's him. But abolish the daily sacrifice. Again, there's some confusion because he did do that in terms of the temple. But the next one, set up the abomination that causes desolation. We already know what that is. And so again, first read through chapter 11, knowing the history. If you have a history book or you're a historian, very fair to apply some of these to Antiochus. But not fair once you've read the other parts of Daniel and Matthew, which we're going to read the Olivet Discourse in the Gospels, as well as Revelation. When we put the whole picture together, we have to adjust that reading and say, oh, wait a minute, we might have thought that he was here in some of the later verses, but he's not. He has left the building. So it's the same event from a different camera angle, right? We've talked about it before, abolishing of the sacrifice and the abomination that causes desolation. See the other videos and the Daniel document, if you want to. If you haven't yet, to get the full deep dive on that. So another way to look at it, just kind of high-level view here from chapter 9 and chapter 11 and chapter 12. Again, the same phrase is used. So in chapter 9, it's more of a theological perspective. It's heaven looking down, and it says he puts an end to sacrificing. Who? The promised Messiah, the anointed ruler who will come. He will put an end. Again, remember the confusion from chapter 9. If we're reading an Antichrist figure in there, but we shouldn't, the language, the three he's, the so-called great debate, I don't know if it's called that, but I'm calling it the great he debate that you didn't know was a debate. All three of those he terms, the pronouns he, are Jesus. That is the simplest way to read that passage. It is a stretch to try to read those as different. People argue about that reality because they know that you can't, it's not a comfortable reading to do that. The reason is because of the idea that, it's not a good guy who puts an end to sacrifice, or maybe it's not a good guy whose people will come and destroy the city and the sanctuary. Again, I'm quoting from Daniel chapter 9. But if we don't have a problem with those, or we delay our discomfort, we postpone our discomfort with the idea that shouldn't be a good guy doing those things, the grammar itself suggests it is the same person. And so, again, we read other passages later, we come back, we can go, oh, okay, yeah, actually the good guy did do all of those things, in fact. And so that we're able to take the comfortable reading, which is nice when you're always able to take the simple reading and not have to figure out something more complex. And so we feel good about that reading. Chapter 11, where we are focusing right now, is more historical. They removed the daily and they set up the abomination. That's earth looking up. That is certainly also true, because who removed the daily sacrifice? The Romans. So again, this forces from him will arise. If it's the Romans, this also makes sense. It doesn't have to be Antiochus. Yes, he did remove. I'm going to say he paused sacrifices, because they resumed in a few years. So yes, he did some of that, but it's not that he's the only one who did anything remotely like that. In fact, the Romans did as well. Removing the daily sacrifice is, again, because it's the crucifixion, that's one thing. You could also sort of probably make this stretch to the end of the 77, because as we talk about elsewhere, there's the event complex of the crucifixion and the desolation. They're separated in time, but they're sort of flip sides of the same coin. That's why it says the abomination that causes desolation. They just aren't the same moment in time. One is cause, one is effect, and they could be, kind of come right on the heels of each other, but they could also not. It's not required that they be one moment in time. So the desolation comes later, which was brought by whom? Also brought by the Romans, right? So all of the different ways of reading some of these words here and these pronouns is fine. Also, chapter 12, chronologically, is where we get some of those date markers. This is kind of just a neutral, it's given the time from this to this. And so all of these things are describing the same thing from different event or different perspectives, and in some cases different pronouns, but there's not a problem with that. Why? Because is it fair to say, or true to say, that the Father put Jesus on the cross? Yes, it is. Is it fair and true and accurate to say that Jesus put himself on the cross? Yes, he said, I lay my life down willingly. No one takes it from me. So in a sense, he did those things. He's the main actor, because he's the one, through his death and sacrifice, he is accomplishing the ending of sacrifice. It's also the they. So they did these things. They set up the abomination. Yeah, because who set the cross up and put it in the ground? That would be the Romans. So they also did these things. And finally, not last but not least, and not to leave out another key player, you could also say that the Sanhedrin crucified Jesus. So they also set up the abomination that causes desolation. So you can see that because of the complexity of human affairs, it's appropriate to any of those statements are appropriate. So it's not that it has to just be one actor. There were multiple actors. There are multiple players involved in this complex event. And so if you're describing it from a certain angle, you can say, well, they did it. But you can also be telling a different story from over on this angle and say, well, he did it. All of those statements are true. They're not contradictory. Okay, verses 32 through 35, so give you a little bit of flavor for that register shift. We talked about those who know their God will firmly resist. Those who are wise will instruct many, though for a time they will fall by sword, flame, captivity, and plunder, until the time of the end. Now, we're not talking about kings anymore here. It jumps sort of abruptly into those who know their God, okay? If this was Antiochus, that would be presumably Jews. But again, Daniel's visions are focused on Christ crucified and the new covenant people that are going to be birthed out of that event, simultaneous with the judgment that is brought to the old covenant people. So those who know their God will firmly resist isn't the Jews of 164 to 167 BC. It is the new covenant people. Because again, we're talking 77 now. We've raised the bar. We've raised the discussion from just earthly goings on to cosmic things, okay, involved with the crucifixion. Okay. So notice the activity here is those who are wise will instruct many. So we're not talking armed revolt here. We're talking teaching And then suffering is the things that are described here. And then it mentions until the time of the end. So this does not match the Maccabees, right? They fought back and they won. They were able to achieve that victory, and they got the temple back in order. As you know, when Jesus comes on scene in the Gospels, we read that the temple's functioning just fine, right? Sacrifices are taking place, things are happening. Well, we can't say they're fine. Jesus ended up cleansing the temple, right? Clearing it out because there was a lot of things that were not fine. But you understand what I'm saying? From an operation standpoint, the temple was fully back in order because of the Maccabees. So there's not really this sort of extended time. Maybe one could talk about sort of post Antiochus, but again, Antiochus kind of does his deed and then leaves. And then over time, the Maccabees were able to, I guess, kick out the remaining forces and kind of get things back in order. So it doesn't really match. That history doesn't match the language of these verses. What does match is the 70th seven. Because again, it involves a period of judgment. Revelation is going to unpack this reality on steroids for us. So we don't have necessarily the full understanding just by reading these verses. But a couple of examples or a quick explanation is essentially that judgment period goes from the crucifixion to 70 AD, right? And remember those date markers. It's judgment, it's desolation is decreed, wars will continue. It's the flood marker at the very end. The date of Noah's flood, the end will come like a flood. So that's what's happening in that later period. But keep in mind what also happens during that period. A lot of persecution of Christians, right? Both Jewish Christians, but then is not specific only to them, but also the Gentile Christians of the early church, Nero's great persecution. And in fact, not just sword and captivity and plunder. And I haven't done a deep dive on this, but I don't think flame is as common a term in Old Testament judgment. Again, I could be wrong. Somebody can correct me. Usually it's things like sword, you're going to get killed, be taken captive. Disease is one. Pestilence, whatever, what's the word for pestilence? Locusts, plagues, things like that. Individual sickness, so, bodily sickness. And famine. Famine's another common one. I don't know that flame is really as common a one, but in the 70th seven, our good friend, the dirtbag Nero, burned Christians alive, right? So he decided to do that for fun, put them on poles and let them be street lamps to light some of the streets, and just had an absolute terrible persecution of Christians during that time period. So that certainly fits, right? So for a time, they will fall. It's limited in scope. That also fits the 70th seven and the historical record for that time period, as well as Revelation. There will be a time. There's a great tribulation coming, but it's going to end. Jesus, I think, in the Olivet Discourse is where it's mentioned that if that time weren't cut short, so there is a cutting short. It is a limited time. Mentions here, though for a time they will fall, but those who are wise will instruct many. So there will be a multiplication of those who know their God, who will firmly resist, and they will suffer. There will be some loss until the time of the end. So that again, 60s AD was a rough time, but after that, both Rome's strength fades, as well as Jerusalem is ruined forever, and then the gospel spreads much more freely in the ensuing centuries, right? So it doesn't match the Maccabees, but I think this is the last place I mentioned Maccabees, so I need to make sure to point this out while I'm thinking about it. This is why I would say Maccabees isn't scripture inspired, because they claim that it does match. And that is probably the source. I haven't done a deep dive on that particular issue to decide or learn where did this originally come from, this idea that Antiochus was this key figure and that what he did was the abomination that causes desolation from Daniel. But the book of Maccabees says that. So I think that's where it probably started. Whenever those books were written, they kind of claimed that was what was happening, and so they claimed credit for sort of cleaning that up. Obviously, that would be a big accomplishment, and so we can be sympathetic to the desire to do that or how they landed there. Again, I would point out that one of the lessons we should learn from that is that we shouldn't try to make our year in history. So this currently, I'm in 2026. We shouldn't make our year in history be or demand that it be cosmically significant, because the reality is most years are not cosmically significant in this kind of perspective. They are in terms of your deeds and my deeds, how we behave, how we live our lives, does have cosmic significance in that sense for us and for eternity. But in terms of these kinds of prophecies, fulfilling a biblical prophecy, not every year is a year of great impact or is going to show up in the written record. And so they fell prey to that, and fair enough, it was a shocking and terrible thing for them to have that happen, that what Antiochus did. And so they read that as, that event. So they claim that that's what Antiochus was, performed the abomination that causes desolation. It did cause desolation, but only for 3 years. And so then, they restored it. So I have to reject the book of Maccabees on those grounds, because I think the numbers that we have now from the 77 conclusively show that that's not what the abomination was. It's a big deal, and it was a terrible thing, and Antiochus was a dirtbag, but it doesn't rise to the level of the abomination that causes desolation. And it doesn't fit the dates, and it doesn't fit the rest of Scripture in terms of what the abomination that causes desolation has to fit with. So it's not that. Until the time of the end, another Daniel marker that we know from other passages. So again, a heads up that, hey, you're talking about the 70th 7. The time of the end is from the crucifixion to the end of the Old Covenant. So the text has shifted completely. These are words that are not in the previous part of chapter 11. But a lot of people will agree somewhere in here they would cut this off. I think certainly by 36. I think verse 36 maybe is where a lot of people put it. So they would say maybe that this suffering and stuff falling for a time might still be in the Antiochus period, but at some point they leap it forward to something either in the time of Jesus or even the distant future, depending on what eschatological camp you're talking about. But for sure, everyone can agree that the language here is different than prior verses. Okay. Verse 36, the king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. In this verse, there is no north. In the previous part of 11, there's like the king from the north, the king from the south, and there's all these different details around. None of that is here. There's no dynasty listed. There's no king, a location. And so this king kind of comes out of nowhere a little bit. Unless you want to read it as Antiochus. But again, we've shown, I think, that that's very hard to leap over verses 31 through 35 and still have verse 36 be about Antiochus. So not the easiest reading to read it that way. So if it's someone different, who is it? We have to start trying to understand. He exalts himself above every god. That exceeds any Seleucid king, so that doesn't really work. He speaks against the God of gods. This sounds very similar to chapter 7 in Daniel, the horn. Talks about it will raise itself up. It will speak against the God of gods. It will challenge the prince of the host. So again, you see this consistency across the different visions in Daniel where the same language is used. There's this pattern of roadmap of empires. There's a pivot. Then we talk about stuff that's very different, but very consistent across the different visions, just like the roadmap is consistent across the visions. The structural apparatus is gone. What had gotten us here, the roadmap of empires, is now not here anymore. It's talking about these things very differently. Implies a new entity has entered to our narrative here. So why is the confusion? Well, there's a lot of confusion. Why is it there? Well, it's natural for a few reasons. The previous 10 verses are about Antiochus. And it's not that Antiochus isn't there. It's not that he's not in chapter 11. He certainly is in chapter 11. It's that he is not, or we have to pay attention to when he leaves the building, and then know that we're not talking about him anymore after that point. There's no explicit transition markers. It doesn't say, and behold, another king arrived on scene. So you kind of have a few verses that aren't about kings at all, and about the suffering and those who are wise will instruct many. Then it starts talking about another king, but it doesn't have a clear indicator of like, hey, here's the new king. And then Antiochus did pause sacrifices, and he did desecrate the temple. So there's that linkage. And so somebody may be saying, well, yeah, you're calling confusion, but it makes perfect sense. He did stop sacrifices. I'm saying he paused sacrifices, and he desecrated the temple. Okay, point made. 1 Maccabees quotes Daniel's language. Okay, so I already covered that a little bit early. Have to reject Maccabees because of that. No offense to the Maccabees themselves. So readers naturally assume continuity, that it's just moving along, talking about the same guy, the same time, the whole time, and the same actions. So the confusion is an artifact of proximity. So he is the last guy talked about before we launch into the 70-7. The confusion is because he is the last marker in the roadmap of empires in chapter 11, and so it's fair, from that perspective. However, if we dig a little bit deeper and look a little broader in Scripture, we're going to find that there's actually not near as much a match as is claimed or often thought. First of all, a pig on an altar is not the same as killing the Son of God. Now again, if you don't understand that the abomination that causes desolation is the crucifixion, you wouldn't necessarily be able to create this bullet point. But knowing that the abomination that causes desolation is the crucifixion of Jesus, then we know a pig on an altar is actually not a picture of that at all. Now, people might say, I think more often it's associated with being sort of related to or foreshadowing of a later Antichrist, which we'll come to in a little bit here. And so it's not they're not looking for a picture or something that parallels Jesus on the cross. They would say that this parallels other desecrations of the temple and other Antichrist type figures. But so again, in terms of the confusion for the cross, there really isn't any confusion. It doesn't look like the cross at all. But if we're not expecting the cross, we're not looking for the cross, we're not aware that that's the abomination, we might start to think that Antiochus looks a lot like this passage. But he stopped worship temporarily for about 3 years. That's another point of confusion, but we'll get to the numbers. They say, it's similar to Daniel's 3.5 or the 1290. But that's a very temporary stoppage of sacrifice. The other rendered it permanently complete. When we talk about chapter 9, for example, and those 6 umbrella redemptive things that are taking place, it's putting an end to sin. That sounds a lot more permanent. Those 6 things that go together and put an end to sin there is much more definitive. So putting an end to sacrifice is a thing that happens with greater finality for it to be such a big deal. So him rendering it, temporarily offline for a few years just doesn't rise to the appropriate level. Again, part of that is because we haven't appreciated that the abomination is the crucifixion, and so it has cosmic significance for all eternity. And this 3-year hiatus of temple worship is a big deal. Certainly for the Jewish people, it was a big deal at that point, the covenant people. But from God's perspective, not certainly at the level of the crucifixion. So we might say that the perceived resemblance is an artifact of the assumption. What is the assumption? The assumption is temple desecration. We cover this a little bit more elsewhere as well, but if you assume temple desecration, then you think, he looks a lot like it. But we've established now that the abomination that causes desolation isn't temple desecration. Okay, it's not something offensive or something that's not supposed to be in the Holy of Holies, in the physical building of the temple building. That's not what it is. And so if we're not looking for that, again, Antiochus in 167, 164 BC, whatever year it was, does not really have any significant features of it that would relate to the stuff that Daniel is really trying to talk about. Now, the response might be, what he did is such a significant event that you're telling me it's not even covered in Scripture, that it would be talking about him right up until, the ships come, he loses heart, and then he rages against the holy people on his way out. And that's it. It doesn't really unpack that. That's exactly what I'm saying. And that's not as shocking as it might first seem, because there's a lot of temple desecrations in Scripture. Some are prophesied. Many are not even prophesied. I shouldn't say many. There's a few. So Shishak in 925 BC plundered the temple treasures. This was not prophesied. There's no scriptural basis or no scriptural prophecy for this event. Ahaz, who was an Israelite king in 735 BC, he built a pagan altar. He closed the doors so no one could come in, and that was not prophesied. Manasseh, similarly, did terrible stuff for decades. That was not prophesied by the prophets. Antiochus, 167 BC, is the guy we're talking about. Not in canonical scripture, it's in the Apocrypha, more in detail of what he did. I would say it is that one line in chapter 11 here that he raged against the holy people, or whatever it said. So in that sense, it's in scripture in this prophecy, but it is not unpacked in detail. Nebuchadnezzar, 586 BC, prophesied as covenant judgment. Okay, not just as some significant historical event. It's prophesied because it was covenant judgment. That's the one that Daniel was sitting in that exile when he got these visions. And then Titus in Rome in 70 AD also prophesied right here in Daniel and covered at length in Revelation. So what we see, though, is that Scripture prophesies covenant judgments and it prophesies desolation generally. I'm going to make a claim here that I'm sort of holding loosely. I can't say that I've done extensive research on this, but it doesn't seem to me like Scripture regularly prophesies a whole lot of details of the desecrations themselves, of like, oh, he's going to sacrifice a pig on the altar. It doesn't say that. It doesn't detail the desolation or the desecration acts themselves. And so I think in this case, for Antiochus to do what he did, it's not inappropriate at all. To me, this interpretation doesn't strain any kind of established principle that a terrible act like this on the temple, the desecrating of the temple, needs to be covered at length or in depth in Scripture. That's not true. I don't see that has to be the case. And so again, the language of the pivot in verse 31 all the way through verses 35 to me are pretty weighty and are not offset by some principle that says, no, there has to be more description. That was such a terrible event. It happened before, and it's what foreign kings did when they came to town and ransacked and pillaged and burned. So the details of that aren't so important, again, for prophetic messianic purposes. I'm not saying they're not important. It was obviously devastating for those people in that time period, but it's not a requirement that has to be detailed out in Scripture. Furthermore, why chapter 12, verse 11 can't be Antiochus? Well, for one thing, the 1,290 days don't work. The desecration happened in this month in 167 BC. The rededication of the temple happened that month. And so that is 1,095 days. It's not 1260, it's not 1290, it's not 1335. And those are the three Daniel chapter 9 through 12 numbers. And it's also not 1150, which is the number we could potentially have from Daniel chapter Daniel chapter 8. But we cover that in the 2300 video, where it's 2300 evenings and mornings. It's not 1150. But if you divide it by 2, then you could get 1150. But we've proven that's not an option anyway. But even if it was, it's not 1150. It's 1095. Excuse me. So as we know now, Daniel's numbers are precise. They're not ballpark numbers. And so maybe this could have been considered support. I think with the 70th 7 now well established, that's going to be even harder to support that. Those are ballpark numbers for the amount of time that the temple was in ruins because of Antiochus to the time that the Maccabees restored it and got everything back up and running. Again, you look at Daniel, you look at these visions, the point of them is not something like that desecration of the temple. The point of those individuals and their empires is to be road signs and mile markers on our journey to the real big thing. And so that has to be kept in mind, because that also helps. But it certainly helps that the numbers don't add up. But they do when we do it the right way. We have the 70th 7. We know all those numbers fall into place there on the right. All 4 of those numbers line up perfectly to the day. And so this time period of Antiochus doesn't fit any of those numbers. Also, none of those map to anything in the Maccabean history of that time period as well. So you would only at best have one number, but then none of the other numbers could match, right? Well, suppose the 1095 was somehow construed to be 1260. Still not going to give you the other 3 numbers, and it's not that they're all about the same number. We've shown with great, precision that these numbers have an impressive, an impossible, basically, level of specificity and alignment that if it was wrong, you wouldn't be able to get those numbers. Okay, this one really, to me, should have been the slam dunk all along. I don't know why this hasn't ended this debate years ago. Jesus treats the abomination as a future event in Matthew 24. He tells the disciples, when you see the abomination that causes desolation standing in Jerusalem, or standing where it ought not be, then blah, blah, blah. So the Olivet Discourse, to me, disproves that Antiochus is the abomination that causes desolation. And that was 200 years after him that Jesus is telling them that, and he treats it as a future event. Again, we don't need any of this shadow business. We'll talk about that at the end here. So in terms of Antiochus himself, like, this invalidates that reading. You can't have that be the abomination that causes desolation, which again means is this further support of the register shift in verses 31 through 35, that it's talking about the abomination that causes desolation. It uses the phrase. Jesus helps us understand what that phrase is. It's not Antiochus and his pig on the altar. Furthermore, chapter 12, because we're talking about verse 11 here and saying this is just one other reason why it can't be him, because chapter 12, verse 11 doesn't fit the Antiochus context. Michael stands up. There's war. Okay, the intro to chapter 10, I think it is, that kicks all of chapter 11 off. The angel says, I'm here to tell you about a great war. The great war isn't Antiochus. Again, if you think, oh, great war, that must be Antiochus, or maybe it was Alexander the Great. You're not paying attention. You're not listening. You're missing the point. Please listen to me. It is about a roadmap that leads to a pivot, that leads to the real thing. The real thing is Christ crucified and the 70th seven. And so that involves a cosmic war. Revelation lines up with that perfectly. We'll have videos on that, so you can go watch the Revelation videos. The Revelation document details all of this. So Michael is in town during that period. Okay, doesn't make sense. He's nothing. There's no other scriptural basis for Michael, the angel. By the way, that's Michael the archangel, being involved in 167 BC. He's involved when the son is birthed, the dragon and the woman and the child that's born. Those visions that involve angelic hosts and angelic judgment and angelic war are the second half of the 70th seven. So you can't have Antiochus in chapter 12 here, where Michael is standing up and there's angelic and an angel comes and tells you in chapter 10, I'm here to tell you about a great war. This vision is about a great war. Then he tells you several hundred years of human history, which has a bunch of wars. So which war is it, right? The point is, he gives a roadmap that has now I'm jumping to the other video a little bit, but the flavor of this one is war. And he says, I'm telling you about a great war. Let me show you the history from the perspective of war and how there'll be a bunch of kings fighting. There's always war. And then here's a big war. The other visions have similar kind of common thread or flavor where, I'm going to tell you the 70th seven from the perspective of judgment, vindicating the right and declaring the wrong. Let me tell you about the history of some stuff and things, that's the horn, things doing bad things and needing to get judged. And then we'll talk about the real period of cosmic judgment for all, once and for all time. So that's the flavor. So Antiochus doesn't fit here. Michael is standing up. There's unprecedented distress. There's resurrection of the dead mentioned in chapter 12. We unpack that elsewhere as well. Spoiler alert or quick summary is it's not the distant resurrection of the dead. It's an objection. It's a fair objection to this framework. It's one of the kind of the few that sticks. It doesn't exactly line up perfectly at first read. And that is if you're reading that as an actual resurrection of dead people. But what we'll show is that there's enough language around that. It's really only one troubling verse among several, but all the verses around it are, I think, very clearly pointed at the new birth. And so that resurrection is not an actual end times, of the end of the world type of resurrection. It's talking about, again, Christ crucified is the point of all of Daniel. So Christ crucified, we start talking about resurrection there of the people of God. It's not Jesus's resurrection. It talks about many people is the new birth. It's talking about the arrival of the new covenant, and that those who were dead will now, and dead in their sins, will now live. So that's talked about there. Again, there's no resurrection around Antiochus. It doesn't make any sense. So this is stuff that's not a Seleucid king persecuting the Jews for 3 years. That was a terrible thing. But that's not the language of chapter 12. So you can't have chapter 12 be about Antiochus. But 12 is the end of the chapter 11's empire train, okay, and that roadmap. So that's why we're talking about chapter 12. It's related. Okay. The phrase abomination that causes desolation, again, that's a clue. We know that from other passages. It's the same one from chapter 9. That's a clue to us in chapter 11 when we see it. The time gap statement, until the time of the end, also used elsewhere in Daniel. The grammatical unmooring at verse 36, so there's no more discussion of these, the king from the north, very specific. It's just a generic king. Not unpacking that here. This video, I'm mainly just trying to show that Antiochus has left the building in verse 30. So the short answer, though, on that king is that is the Great War. It's talking about Satan. Satan is the force behind Rome. It's not even really talking about Rome, but there's some overlap because Rome is the empire that is on the earth that he's working through at that time. But he's the force behind that. Revelation unveils that clearly for us, that the dragon is the one. He gives his power to the beast, okay? That is Rome. That beast is Rome, and he gives his power to the beast. So he's the one, he's the driving force behind that. In Daniel, from this cosmic perspective in the 70th seven, post-pivot, it's talking from that perspective. And so that's why there are things everybody agrees, like, wait a minute, no regular king could even do some of these things. This has very big level, it's like, yeah, we recognize that language. But we say, well, the mistake is to say either it's just prophetic, hyperbole, and it really does apply to Antiochus, or there must be a really, really bad guy coming who's way worse than Antiochus, and Antiochus is a foreshadowing of that guy, and he's going to do all these terrible things, and that is the Antichrist, and he's going to come in the distant future. That's also a wrong reading of the passage. It is understanding that it's the 70th seven constrains that, by the way. So you say, well, it could be that. Well, no, it can't be that anymore because of the time constraint of the 70th seven. That's what Daniel is talking about. All the visions align, same verbiage in the different ones for that post-pivot period. And that doesn't allow you to take it to the future then. So there is no distant Antichrist in the future from where I sit right here today. And so that can't be the explanation for these passages. What can it be? Again, the 70th seven is the answer. The second half, 70th seven, is when cosmic war is happening. Satan is thrown down. Jesus said, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven to the earth. He said, now is the prince of this world cast out or cast down. So the cross is what was bringing Satan down. And Michael was involved in that. There was angelic warfare. We covered that elsewhere. So that is the explanation for how the king described here in chapter 11 can be something that sounds far above what a regular king could do. It does sound that way, and that is a correct recognition of that language. The mistake is in applying that to either Antiochus and saying it's just hyperbole, or a distant future guy who really can fulfill all of that stuff. Neither of those. It's that this is the cosmic war that happened around the life of Christ and the crucifixion, and the crucifixion itself was part of that war. That's part of the craziness of the whole crucifixion event, that it was simultaneously a great war and a great victory was won, but it sure appeared like a loss. It involved sacrifice and defeat and death. So it's all of these dualities wrapped up in one. That is, again, Daniel is explaining that. He's not talking about something in the distant future from our standpoint here. He's talking about future from him, when that cosmic period of great covenantal significance and eternal significance was going to be happening. Okay, so putting it all together, summary, verse 31, forces from him will arise. They will desecrate the sanctuary, abolish the sacrifice, and set up abomination. Okay, forces from his imperial context will arise. That's what it means, from him, and that's Rome. It means now the main actors are on stage. So Antiochus was the very final mile marker, and we need to forget about him. He just got us to this point. Now we say, as we head along this journey, we're saying, hey, now we're about to arrive at the stuff that we want. If we're on a road trip with the family, hey kids, wake up. You've been taking a nap. Now's the time to pay attention. We're here. We're there. They will provide the crucifixion. The Romans, right? That empire will provide the crucifixion. They will abolish the daily sacrifice. Again, we talked about already different perspectives. It's they, it's he, it's another they, it's another he, it's God, it's Jesus, it's the Romans, it's the Sanhedrin. All can take some credit from certain perspectives, right, on doing these deeds. They will desecrate the sanctuary. When? At the end of the 70th. Okay, we already know that. So that all checks out. Antiochus has left the building in verse 30. He is gone. He's not being talked about anymore. That is the transition point. So, I want to end there, though. I want to make one final thing, kind of shifting a little bit from just the text and sort of more of a plea to the church, and sort of what is a motivator behind some of this for me. It is that we need to stop breaking Christ crucified into two parts and giving half to Antiochus, the shadow Antichrist, and the other half to an imaginary future real big Antichrist. Okay? That is what has been very frustrating as I've come to understand this and see what we've done with it. The abomination that causes desolation is the crucifixion. That event, and fair enough, it's a confusing event. That's sort of inherent in the event itself, right? It is God, it is man. It is the entire pile of the sins of the world on him in that one moment in time. It is also the utter and total elimination of sin at the same time, right? It is a cosmic victory, as I already mentioned. It is the act that wins a war. It is also an act that seems like the opposite of winning a war. It's dying. It's losing a war. It's losing your very life. He had nothing at that moment in time, but as we learn in Daniel chapter 7 and 8, that he gained everything from that moment in time, and because of that one deed. So you have all of this kind of duality, all of this confusion. It's simultaneously horrendous. It's the abomination. It's terrible. And it's also the most awesome, precious, holy thing that there ever will be, right? So all of that is wrapped up in the cross and the crucifixion of Jesus as Messiah. And Daniel in these different visions are giving us different angles on that same thing. Why? Because it takes a lot to unpack it and to understand it fully. And we have to study it and think about it, and it impacts our lives. And so it's worthy of a lot of attention and scrutiny and those kind of things. And so what is disappointing here and what we need to fix is that instead of us staring at that and trying to unpack and marvel at that and be in awe of that and him and you know what that means and the love that's represented that would make him do that for all mankind, instead, look what's happened. We've split it in a way into two, and we say, okay, well, half of this abomination thing is maybe this guy Antiochus, but only half, because some of the other language is just not appropriate to him. We know it doesn't really fit. And so what do we do with the rest of it? Well, let's give that to this other guy, whether it's 70 AD, although that is actually the Antichrist. Spoiler alert. I won't do the spoiler, but go read the Revelation document, watch the Revelation videos. It's usually the future Antichrist that's given. So half goes to Antiochus, and he's a shadow of the Antichrist, and he's not the full thing. The real one's going to come later. Look what we've done. We've taken, there's a shadow of things. Christ, we know that from the New Testament. A shadow of Jesus on the cross. Yeah, there's even that. Abraham killing or almost killing his son Isaac, sacrificing Isaac. That is a shadow. That is a picture of the abomination that causes desolation. Sure, so there's foreshadowing, there's typing. I get that. I'm not saying there's not. But not in this case. And we need to stop it with the Antichrist. He's such a big deal, and that there's even shadows of him and precursors to him. No, that's not the case. Okay, now again, you can say, well, clearly I can see Antiochus, he did sacrifice him. Okay, fine. He did do that historically. But we've eliminated the possibility of interpretations that have this future Antichrist, so that he can't be a shadow of something in the future. Furthermore, he's not the only one who did that kind of stuff. As we listed in this very video, there's a whole lot of desecrations and desolations that happened over time. As a result of covenant judgment, God brought those things, and so they're terrible, yes, but we need to stop blowing it out of proportion and essentially giving far more weight and far more attention from the church to this real Antiochus and this imaginary future Antichrist, or even Nero, the real Antichrist. Oops, I gave the spoiler. Even he's not that big of a deal in Revelation. Jesus is the big deal. And so I hope that we can let Antiochus lie in the grave, stop resurrecting him. He's gone in verse 30. Let him be gone. He's left the building. Let's leave it that way. And furthermore, let's not also take any more energy and project it into the future on some imaginary Antichrist future from this point right now. It's a distraction, and it distracts from the real focus and the real focal point of Daniel's prophecies and Revelation, which is Christ crucified. That is the teaching of the New Testament. It's the teaching of Revelations. It's the point of the prophecies here in Daniel. And so hopefully you'll agree with that. And we can start to get rid of these distractions and these doctrines that sort of do this, to take away glory from Christ. I know that people are not trying to do that, so I'm not saying that. This is not aimed at individuals or people at all. It's just saying if we zoom out and look at just the doctrine, this is what sort of is resulting, right? It's like we've taken this thing that is really the glory and awesomeness of Jesus on the cross, and because of a misunderstanding of some of these scriptures, it has gotten split, and we're taking that glory and not just giving it to, diminishing it. We're sort of saying it's not even his glory. It's the Antichrist, some previous one and some future one. So I'll stop repeating myself. Suffice it to say, maybe I'll end with this. What is interesting about this understanding is that the abomination that causes desolation has shifted entirely in a very big way from being the most terrible thing and sort of a badge, a label, let's say, if we want to call it that gets stuck on an antichrist because it's so terrible. Actually, that is a badge that goes on Jesus. It is a badge that goes on Jesus. What do I mean by that? I mean, there is a ton of glory, again, and I know it's upside down, but that's the kingdom. It's upside down and inside out. And so what we have thought was this terrible thing, and it is a terrible thing. Again, it's both at the same time. It is terrible. The cross is terrible. The crucifixion is terrible and horrendous. It ought not be. It's the thing that is standing somewhere it ought not. But at the same time, it's the most incredible thing, and it's the most amazing thing, and it's the most awesome thing, and it's where we get salvation. It's where we're redeemed and we're brought back to God, and we're all of the things. It's the open door. So it's all of those things. And so in that sense, it's a very glorious thing for him, right? His cross, Revelation portrays him over and over, the Lamb who was slain from the foundation of the world, the one who was crucified. So he wears that as a mark. It is permanently his identity. He's chosen that identity of the slain lamb, and the abomination that causes desolation is in some ways kind of a very weird, I get it, badge that doesn't go to the Antichrist. We need to put it back on Christ because it's his claim to fame. And again, in a weird way, I understand it may be kind of like, what are you talking about? But think about it. Think about it. It is a claim to fame. It's a claim to awesomeness and incredible victory and the amazing sacrifice. It's all the things that the cross is. That belongs to him. And we need not have it being split up and parsed out and misassigned to the wrong people. We need to keep it his claim to fame, his claim to glory, Christ crucified.